All right, we're back live in Atlanta at the Global Podcast Studios headquarters. Rich Casanova here on this side of the mic, but on the other side, check this out. We have the man, the author, the podcaster, the Dos Equis man of the studio here today, Mr. Dewayne Hart. He's the host of the Chief of Cybersecurity podcast, and we're going to turn the microphones around a little bit today, and we're going to talk about a very interesting topic that's always topical and always gets a lot of press coverage. And we have the expert to talk about this from the angle of cybersecurity, which is his sandbox and his area of expertise. We're going to be talking about the impact that has on society from the political election standpoint, and specifically the technology and the humans element behind what happens when you close that curtain in the polling booth. So, Dewayne, welcome to the studio.
Well, thank you. I know what happened when that curtain closes. People go put on their iPhones and they sit on top of the voting machine and say, "I hope this candidate wins."
Right.
See, that's what happened.
They say a little prayer or whatever. Yeah.
Yes.
Hope for the best. So, but we can't just base this on a hope and a prayer, right? Because technology is what's going to make it legit and is going to make it valid and is going to make it, eliminate a lot of the uncertainty that happens, right? That's been happening in recent years, right? And, back in the day, we used to have just a paper ballots. Everybody felt comfortable with that, right? Then we had the election where there was hanging chads and everything else happening, a lot of suspicion. So we brought in the next best thing, or ideally would be the hope of the future was technology, right? And that was solid, but then there's some questions. But most of those questions, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, happened because they didn't have these protocols in place.
Rich, one of the disconnect with cybersecurity is that a lot of different sectors are slowly coming on board.
Right.
Outside of the voting machines, look at the manufacturing plants, look at the electrical plants.
Right.
Those was not IT-based systems.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Never.
Right. There were switches and plugs and stuff,
right.
Yeah, right.
So, the voting system has its challenges.
Yep. Well, anytime you bring an element online, it's the yin and yang, right? Because you're going to be more efficient. It's going to be faster, better, all that good stuff, right? But that's only the caveat to that is if you've done your homework and you put the right, you have the checks and balances in place.
I always like to bring up a typical term. It's called having that proactive mindset. In my book, The Cybersecurity Mindset, I always talk about that as being proactive. So with these voting systems, I'm always thinking, prior to them becoming IT-based,
right,
was there really a long thought about how can we make them safer? How can we protect them?
Right.
I'm not the expert, but this is the thinking process that I would have if I was approaching a brand new technology that was onboarded into IT.
Right.
Having that proactive mindset.
Or as we like to call it, the hacker's hat, right? So this is the election's hacker's hat. Yeah.
Yes.
So let's get into it. So in kind of rapid fire, but let's talk about these protocols we mentioned earlier, right? So when the data comes into the polling booth or the polling places, right? So there's a lot of stuff that has to happen prior to that, right? So you're talking about the physical machines themselves. Talk to us a little bit about, the moving parts there.
Okay. When we address physical security, it's like having a lock on the door and everything else on the inside of the building cannot be physically touched. No one can have access to those devices because those devices are offline and they're not networked.
Right.
But imagine if there's a lapse in physical security. That means a hacker could physically walk into a building and they could reverse engineer one of those voting machines. Now, the problem is that a lot of these voting machines are in a warehouse, and once the voting season is over with, they go back to the warehouse, and the question goes, is there any type of continuous monitoring or type of security controls in place where someone would probably go through on a weekly basis making sure that they are not damaged, or also too, are there auditing checks that goes on? Turn it on and make sure it still works. Is the software being updated? Because after a year, software changes.
Oh, yeah. It's kind of like here in Atlanta, we have every decade or so, we have this massive ice storm, right? But those trucks, and everybody complains like, why don't we have the trucks ready, right? But those trucks, they're not needed for like 5 years, and they're just sitting there. And if they're not being maintained when that storm hits, they're not ready, right?
Practice make perfect.
Yep. So, but you kind of blew over this term we talked about before on the air, reverse engineering it. So talk to us about what could happen if hackers have access to the machines during what you call the off season. What kind of reprogramming? I know the answer to this, but I'm intrigued by what you shared with me earlier. So what type of reprogramming could do the machines that could change the outcome of the election?
Okay. When we look at the reverse engineering, we are just taking the design of that system, changing it around in a format that will suit us. So I like to use that term us because I am placing myself in a hacker's mindset.
Right.
Okay. So when it's reversed, the premises is to control the votes in a certain way that it'll sway to the left or like to the right.
Right.
Let's just imagine that if a voting machine has a red button that states Republican, and there's a blue button that states Democrats, right? If someone was in favor of the Republican Party, they could reverse engineer the machine where every button would be red.
Right.
So it makes no difference if you vote blue for them.
Right.
It will favor the vote toward a Republican. All right.
Which is so scary simple, because when you shared that with me earlier, I'm thinking, whoa, I mean, it's not that complicated. It doesn't seem to do, right? And if they push the button, all buttons are going in the direction of whatever the hacker wants to program it. And it seems like from a layman's standpoint, that's a fairly easy rewiring or reprogramming the software to make that happen. So that really, you don't think about the physical security being that big of an issue, those being monitored, but even if they're monitored, because 365 for 3 years in a row, that's a lot of infrastructure investment. So wouldn't it be just as simple as what we're going to talk about? We're going to talk about later is checking the systems before you kind of release them, let them out the door.
Yes. Proactive defense, proactive mindset is that prior to these machines even arriving at a gym or a place, they should be checked, because voting machines should follow the same parameters and the same type of security standards as you would have in a regular type of computer, right?
Right.
Let's go check the software. Let's physically secure it.
Right.
Let's make sure that we are proactive and making sure that there's no vulnerabilities on the system. Even so, during the process, while people are voting, you still need to have some visibility into these voting machines. That's why I think a security operational center would be the standard way to do it, because a security operational center is where you do continuous live monitoring.
Right.
But in this case, there's a check prior to the voting machines being used, and then there's a check afterwards. Now what happens is that if afterwards you find a problem, that could be a major flaw. It could cause issues.
Yeah, address it on the front end. I was just thinking in my head, go back to that analogy of the trucks. Think about and you talked about seasons, right? So politics are typically a 2 to 4 year season, right? Between voting cycles. With that in mind, just think about if this doesn't really resonate from the tech standpoint, think about, again, putting your family vehicle in storage for 3 or 4 years, right? And without even looking at it, you're just going to get all the family in there, load up all the luggage, and hit the road. You probably should check the brake fluid, right? You should probably check if you got gas in there, if the tires are deflated, right? Stuff just happens. Even if they're, if you have somebody watching that car all year for 3 years in a row, somebody again could come in and cut the brake line, or all kinds of stuff that happens in the movies, right? But in this case, it's somewhat simple. Is that, again, a month or so before the election, now you're just monitoring it for that month, right? Because you go in, you check it, you make sure, you run all the protocols to make sure the buttons are going in the right direction, and then you're off to the races. So now let's get to, let's talk about data loss prevention. So we've checked those boxes, right? Getting the machines in order so they're ready to hit the polling centers. So where does data loss prevention come into play?
Databases, information storage. A lot of this information is stored on hard drives. And, for data loss prevention, there's something called data at rest. So that means that the data is being stored on the hard drive.
Right.
But in order to protect that, the information has to be encrypted, and none of that information is encrypted. So that means that if Mr. Hacker had access to that particular voting machine, then that person could manipulate the database,
right?
All right, and change the tables around, and then the results could sway to the left or the right,
right?
But data loss prevention also entails that information that the machine holds on the voter, because that person's information is held.
Wow.
Because the cards like the little cards you put in there.
Yeah. Punch cards.
Yes. Now it's your information is stored. Whoa. Now imagine if someone could gain access to that voting machine and extract information from the database.
Start filtering that and deciding who's going to get invited to the next party, to the next election, right?
That's right.
Wow. I didn't even think about that across my mind. So switching gears, let's talk about, you mentioned a little bit on authentication. So what are some challenges of where the hacker could disrupt that process? From spoofing was one that we talked about. So talk to us about that.
Authentication bypass.
Okay.
Authentication bypass means that there is no authentication. So that means that you don't need a username and password.
Right, bro.
You guys, you have direct access.
Right.
So even to the listeners, imagine you got your laptop, and if you don't have it secured with a password, that means somebody can gain access to it.
Yeah.
And it's the same point here.
Okay.
With this authentication bypass.
And so that opens up the doors of forgery, is what you're saying, potential?
Yes.
Right? And so another element of that is the admin privileges, right? Mm-hmm. So who gets assigned to that? And you raised an interesting point that typically, in many cases, the poll workers are all, this was shocking when you shared this, in many cases, they're sharing the same password.
Yes.
That's problematic, right?
When I went through the Department of Security ICS Advisory 22 TAC 154 TAC 01,
right?
As I was reading through it, I saw a line item that stated that that you have to have unique passwords. So that tells me that there was some kind of check, and in that check, it found out that those poll workers was using the same password. Now
that's crazy.
Now
it's like giving everybody in the neighborhood the same key to your house.
Right. So that's a basic of cybersecurity. There is password protection. You need to have different password for different users, but a lot of times, I guess at these voting sites, it's not taken seriously because, it kind of makes their life easy, right?
Yeah, and
if everybody can use the same password,
right? You just trust that if enough people are volunteering, they have good intentions, and again, probably a lot of ease because a lot of people are volunteers and there's a lot of moving parts. It's not a full-time job that they're doing throughout the year.
Here's something.
Okay.
I think every person that volunteers needs to go through a couple hours of cybersecurity training.
To have that hacker's hat again, yeah.
Yes.
Because you said in previous episodes of your podcast, you talk quite a bit, whether it's a healthcare sector, whether it's government, whether it's a business sector, is that everybody in that organization should have know where to spot the red flags, right?
Yes.
There's been at least some minimal amount of training, right?
Well, part of that cybersecurity mindset is to invoke a thinking process.
Yeah.
And how can people make the best decision? And relaying that to this topic of discussion here, having that cyber awareness training on the voting system will allow people to make better decisions. Things like sharing the passwords.
Right.
It's a no-no.
Yeah.
Because as I said before, I think that when you have these newer technologies, cybersecurity is kind of put in a lapse a little bit until something happens. And that's when the eyes open. And that's when the industry would say, oh, these voting machines has problems. But, this is part of being proactive. It's not to wait until something happens, because trying to be reactive is a lot of labor, a lot of work.
Well, and that's one of the misnomers or challenges with technology, especially on this topic, cybersecurity. We feel like the experts have done their work, so it kind of can give us that false sense of security, right? That all the work's been done on the front end, so no worries moving forward. It's like, again, going back to like, if you're traveling, you kind of have to have certain checkpoints where like you have to, check the oil, check the gas, what have you, right? Check your battery. You can't just drive that car in perpetuity and just figure like it's going to take care of itself.
Well, here's something I want to add on to that. I wrote in the cybersecurity mindset on the situation awareness.
Yeah.
There's a typical term called trust your cyber senses.
Right.
If you think about the humans, right?
Right.
We can see, we can taste, we can smell, and we can touch, and we can hear.
Right.
Now, because of technology, there's another level of senses, which is called your cyber senses.
Okay.
So if you see something wrong, then you should investigate.
Right.
And I think that part of this technology change into the voting system is to invoke those cyber senses in place and say, hey, we need to have this investigative attitude.
Right.
And really home in and start to think about what we're doing, because it's bigger than just taking a ballot and just saying yes, no, and putting it in a box.
Right.
Because there's a lot of cybersecurity chain reactions that occur.
Right.
For the lack of a better word, is what I like to say.
Yeah. Okay. Before you switch gears to, these preventive or actions that we can take to prevent a lot of this stuff, one thing that comes to mind also is we've been talking about like the red or blue button, but they could do a deeper dive into hacking and just pick a specific bill that's going to be passed in their favor, whatever, right?
Yes.
And that can be kind of a little bit hidden, because there's so many issues on the ballots a lot of times. And so it may not appear on the surface as a challenge, but behind the scenes, they could be just attacking a specific topic or bill.
Yeah, you're right about
initiative.
That. I was told that my taxes would reduce.
Right, exactly. Now we got to be careful who's listening to this. Yeah. So, so let's talk now kind of in closing on a final segment of the podcast here about some kind of good news in a sense, right? So we've done all the protocol in advance. We've kind of had that cybersecurity, that hackers, hat on, right? So let's talk about, compliance, in this chain of custody procedures throughout the election cycle. What are some compliance things that we should be aware of or, focus on?
Okay. Well, there's a protection chain as it relates to cybersecurity. Okay. So let's just look at the voting system here, and the chain of custody is stating, okay, well, you got your results from the voting system,
right?
And now those results has to be hand carried to somewhere else. Now, from person A to person B, there should be a chain of custody form. It should be a designated person that's going to actually
sign off on that. Yeah.
Sign off and get the information.
Right.
Because if I'm a hacker, maybe I can get a fake badge
right,
and walk in there and say, I got this, and go out to my car and I manipulate the data and I bring it back in the building.
Wow. Yeah.
Okay. Now, the chain of custody also means that maybe there needs to be an advanced level of background investigation, okay, because certain people may only should get privileges to monitor, where others get privileges to actually hand carry the vote results and so forth. The chain of custody is followed through cybersecurity when it comes to forensics, and I think the chain of custody will go work here as well too, so that evidence is not tampered,
right?
Okay, or the voting machines are not tampered as well, because somebody has to come and take the voting machines out of the building,
right? They have to get moved around,
right? And transfer
right
somewhere else.
Yeah, that's as we kind of do a deeper dive into this, it's kind of mind-boggling if you think about, the way the country operates in terms of which party is in power, what laws are in place, what services are provided to individuals and communities, all the government funding projects. All that happens at the ballot box, and this cybersecurity is a real challenge right now, right? Because, but not only the cybersecurity, but like you talked about earlier, it's the physical transfer of that data. It's background checks on those individuals. What happens during the off season? It's a little overwhelming, right?
Well, it only becomes overwhelming when you don't have a process in place.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Okay, so if you really think about the way cybersecurity is supposed to operate, there's a roadmap of going from point A to point Z.
Right.
And if you follow that roadmap, then you become successful. Right. So with this voting system, there is no roadmap. So that means that people can drive down whatever road they want to.
Exactly. Okay. It's like the Wild Wild West or whatever. Yeah.
Yes.
So this is a work in progress, obviously, right? And it's getting better. I mean, do you have hopes or, for the future that we're going to just get better at this as we progress?
Yes.
Right? It's got to be, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, because it has raised attention.
Right, yeah.
And as I look through plenty of other different technologies that grew into IT,
right,
they have improved, because improving is the only way to make it better.
Right.
Because when we improve, we're always going to achieve the premises of cybersecurity.
Yeah.
Which is to increase protection and lower risk.
Yeah.
And that matures your cybersecurity programs. And the voting systems is a program. It is going to get better, but there may be some challenges. Having a discussion needs to be in place. One of the things I think that will work as well too is that maybe there needs to be a framework or something like that, or just maybe the voting system needs to include its verbiage into other frameworks that are out there for cybersecurity as well.
Okay, I have two other points as we close up here, and you may not have the answers for this, so this could be a teaser for the next episode, or whatever, right, or a future episode. But one thing we didn't talk about was, are there, and maybe this is something we can look at later, unless you already know, but are there other countries that maybe that have done well, that there's a blueprint that we can follow? Is there other success stories that have used this roadmap that you're talking about and has kind of perfected it?
From my research, this is a global issue.
Right.
I've actually did research and look in other countries that having the same problem, because the issue with voting systems is that they were never IT based.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. And if something was not IT based, then it's like you got to get through all the pain points,
right,
before you become very, very effective.
Right.
And I believe that it will get better, but there are pain points.
Exactly. Yeah. It's going to be, Yeah, it's like working out or whatever. This, no pain, no gain kind of thing, right? It's going to take some time. So the last question is on, we talked about before we went on the blockchain. So do you see this coming into place in the future? Could this help adding that element to it? Because from a layman's perspective, what we hear about the blockchain, not just, Bitcoin, but the way it's programmed is all of those unique moving parts are changing in warp speed that adds another layer of security to that. Does that make sense? Or would you buy into that? Or is there something there?
It's my take. Blockchain is growing.
Right.
Blockchain now is slowly moving and building its foundation.
Right.
And when there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of action.
Right.
So I would not rule it out.
Right.
But I will say that there's going to be some new technologies and some new standards and some new processes that come in place that is going to help the voting systems.
Right.
Blockchain could actually be one of the sources.
Yeah.
But we will see.
Yeah. Stay tuned, as we say. Yeah. All right, Dewayne, well, it was a pleasure having you in the studio again for that episode of interview with Mr. Dewayne Hart, the author, the podcaster, all things chief of cybersecurity podcast. Again, Rich Casanova here for the Global Podcast Studios in Atlanta. Stay tuned for his next episode and more interviews to come.
That's right. I got another one coming up, and it's called End-to-End Vulnerability Management. We're going to talk about vulnerability management, and we're going to be able to build an end-to-end process for readers and for listeners to understand the full scope of a vulnerability management lifecycle.
And there's hints and rumors we might be taking this on the road, but that's we'll talk about that next time.
Okay.